Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into a truly gripping, deeply personal story. We are unpacking one man's dramatic transition from the very familiar, quiet fields of a multi-generational Ohio farm directly into the mud and blood of the World War II infantry. It is a massive culture shock, and it's a journey we're going to follow closely. So let's kick things off with a pretty wild question, right? How does a deferred 28-year-old farmer, and a father of two no less, suddenly find himself bound for the absolute meat grinder of World War II Europe? Well, in early 1944, the U.S. Army was facing a massive manpower shortage right ahead of the D-Day invasions. I mean, they desperately needed men, but they also needed food. And this explainer is the story of how that profound national tension literally tore one specific family apart. Section 1. The farmer is drafted. Leaving Albin Road. Our story centers on James Hertzfeld. Jim, born in September 1915, was a 28-year-old working the multi-generational family farm in Maumee, Ohio, alongside his parents, Charles and Charlotte. Jim was married to Georgette, born in March 1920, and they already had two young boys, Tommy and Bobby, with a third baby on the way. Looking at Jim's draft registration card, it completely grounds him as an agricultural civilian. His work was absolutely vital to the war effort. But that 1944 manpower crisis, it changed everything. His father, Charles, likely out of a really deep sense of duty and patriotism, actually went to the local draft board and told them he could handle the farm alone without his only son. And just like that, Jim's deferment was gone. He was getting drafted.
Well, you can probably guess the domestic fallout was immediate. When Jim was drafted, Georgette was 6 months pregnant and now, essentially, a single mother. So she packed up her two boys and moved off her in-laws' farm. She relocated into town, just a few blocks away from her own parents, George and Blanche Wittebort, and her uncle and aunt, Julian and Amy Mason. She understandably wanted to be surrounded by her own family for help. And honestly, she was likely harboring some serious anger and resentment over her father-in-law's decision to just offer Jim up to the draft board like that.
Section 2. A Journey Down South. Parts Unknown. On March 30th, 1944, Jim enlisted at Fort Thomas, Kentucky. He wasn't there long, but the civilian farmer vanished in hours, replaced by Private Hertzfeld, bound for parts unknown. Just look at this quote from his very first letter home. "I washed pans twice as big as a wash tub, cut up apples, oranges, and meat, cubed it up all by hand. It's a visceral, sensory shock, isn't it?" Jim is a guy totally used to managing an entire harvest, but here the Army immediately puts his seasoned farmer's hands to grueling, mundane KP labor before his training even begins. Just days later, Jim was put on a troop train heading south to Texas. Now, looking out that train window, his agricultural eye was always working. He processed the blooming oats and spring gardens of the Midwest, constantly comparing it to his farm back in Ohio. But that familiar, rich, dark soil soon gave way to the blinding red sand and scrub brush of Texas. As a farmer, he actually wrote that seeing nothing growing but brush really depressed him. He literally just wanted to see a little corn or wheat to feel somewhat better. Section 3. The Camp Fannin Grind. Shaping an Infantryman. Jim eventually arrived at Camp Fannin in East Texas. This was a massive, sweltering infantry replacement training center where he faced a brutal 17-week cycle. The daily schedule was absolutely punishing. We're talking 4:30 a.m. reveille, exhausting forced marches through the intense heat, relentless weapons training, and the constant hand scrubbing of their fatigues because of blowing red sand and torrential rains that would completely flood their wooden huts. The physical toll on Jim's 28-year-old knees, ankles, and feet was immense. Not to mention, he complained constantly about how terrible the Army food was. A major part of this training involved what the Army called night problems. Basically, this meant simulated combat patrols and maneuvers conducted in complete darkness. These exercises pushed Jim to his absolute physical and mental limits. The only brief respites from this misery were incredibly rare treats, like when a Tommy Dorsey show actually came to camp to entertain the exhausted men. But amidst all this isolation and the intense culture shock of sharing a barracks with young teenagers from entirely different backgrounds, Jim did find a crucial lifeline. He befriended Howard Calm, a fellow Army recruit who also happened to be from Northwest Ohio. These two local boys bonded deeply, leaning on each other through the grueling training, and they remained best friends all the way up to the replacement depots in Europe. Section 4. Love, Duty, and Resentment. The Dual World Contrast. The true emotional core of the story lies in Jim's letters home, which reveal this intense tug of war between his harsh Army reality and his devotion to his family. He basically tried to micromanage the home front from afar. He constantly worried about Georgette's pregnancy, making sure she was taking care of herself, and he'd occasionally toss in a cheeky, somewhat risque comment about his romantic longing for her. He obsessed over their finances, ensuring Georgette had plenty of money while his own net pay was a meager $9.45. But he also grappled with immense frustration. It stung to see cousins and peers back home keeping their agricultural deferments. And while he was incredibly angry at his parents, especially his dad, for letting him get drafted and letting the farm's crops go to weeds, in his stoic manner, he still tenderly asked about their health.
Yet, despite all this resentment and his awful physical ailments, Jim was fiercely principled. Look at this term, gold brick. It means shirking duties or faking illness to avoid work. In his letters, Jim made it absolutely clear to Georgette that he would not gold brick. Georgette even looked into getting the Red Cross to bring him home. But Jim refused to take a temporary pass for the farm harvest or even the birth of his son if it wasn't a full hardship discharge. He had a profound sense of duty and honor to see things through to the end.
Section 5. Bivouac to brief furlough. The final test.
In late July 1944, Jim faced the absolute climax of his basic training, the dreaded final field exercise. His own words capture the impending misery perfectly. He wrote, "It is a 7-mile trip and about 56 pounds of weight. I don't know how I will stand it. They say bivouac is hell." This 12-day bivouac was designed to accurately simulate combat conditions, forcing trainees to sleep in the open, dig foxholes, and operate with limited supplies. It was the ultimate physical test before they shipped out. Now, what's really amazing is this number, 10. Jim actually survived that hellish bivouac and earned a hard-won 10-day furlough. It provided an immense emotional release. He finally traveled back home to Ohio, enjoyed those family meals he so desperately missed, and, most importantly, got to hold his newborn third son, Mike, who had just been born on July 9th while Jim was stuck in basic training. Section 6. Destination. Omaha Beach. The pipeline to Europe.
Leaving his family behind once more, Jim entered the final phase of this journey at Fort Meade, Maryland. Now, Fort Meade was a massive replacement depot, characterized by the agonizing sit around and wait phase. The uncertainty and anxiety there were just suffocating. Jim was issued new winter gear, realized he would likely be separated from his buddy Com, who was in a different platoon, and just waited for those inevitable orders to ship overseas.
Look at how incredibly fast this timeline moved. Drafted in late March, sweating through basic training in Texas from April to August, and by late September 1944, Jim boarded a troop transport, crossed the Atlantic to England, and eventually stepped off a boat onto Omaha Beach in France. Astonishingly, Omaha Beach was still being used as a makeshift port to funnel replacements into the theater, more than 3 months after D-Day. Throughout this entire ordeal, Jim's letters were a lifeline, connecting his two worlds, and they really showcase his pragmatism, humor, and unbroken identity. He would constantly sign off his letters to Georgette with the phrase, "Keep your end gate up." It's a popular farmer's phrase derived from keeping a wagon or truck's end gate closed so you don't spill your produce. It basically meant keep your chin up. Even as an infantry replacement heading straight into a war zone, he was still an Ohio farmer, comforting his wife. Which leaves us with this provocative final thought. What happens when an ordinary farmer steps off a boat onto Omaha Beach straight into the European meat grinder? Jim's transition from the soil of Ohio to the muddy front lines of Europe represents the staggering human cost of the replacement system. That intense journey continues in part 2 of this story. Thank you for joining me for this explainer. And as Jim would say, keep your end gate up.